Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 18th, 2022. And today in history, this is the 80th anniversary, March 18th, 1942, one of the worst executive orders in history. So on this episode, I'm going to tell you about Executive Order 9102 from, of all people, FDR. What a surprise. And the War Relocation Authority it established. The result was that well over 120, if not 130 or 40,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes and put into prison camps for the remainder of World War II. The majority of those people were U.S. citizens. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us, all the archives of the show for almost 4 years, individual episodes. Each has their own blog post, and there you're going to find all the platforms that we're on, both video platforms and audio-only podcast platforms, plus stuff that I reference in each episode I put in the show link so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15-ish minutes. It's important stuff, and I want to start out with a quick background. We have to go a little further back to EO 9066. Here's how Mike Meharry put it. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt inked his name to Executive Order 9066 on February 19th of 1942. It opened the door for the roundup of some 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens living along the west coast of the U.S. and their imprisonment in concentration camps. And they were concentration camps. The U.S. government also caged around 11,000 Americans of German ancestry and some 3,000 Italian Americans. And we use, well, let's get to Dave Benner here. He said, President Roosevelt then, so we have Executive Order 9066, which created the process, the order to have exclusion. They were concerned about an invasion. And then President Roosevelt, Dave Benner writes, engaged in efforts to relocate citizens by issuing a secondary decree. And that's what we're covering today, Executive Order 9102, which specifically established the War Relocation Authority. This was the new agency or organization that was going to handle this stuff. The new federal institution was bestowed the power, Dave writes, to forcibly seize and relocate individuals into the camps. And Congress passed unanimously, and FDR signed it, of course, a law as well. I forget the actual public act number, but made it illegal to violate the terms of 9066 and the like. And I mentioned that these are camps, and I know they want us to think that these were like detention centers or, I don't know, whatever kind of language they want to use. They were concentration camps. Here from the Bancroft Library from University of California, there's a bunch of images. I can just scroll through them. In Arizona, camp in Colorado. Of course, we know the one at Hart Mountain in Cody, Wyoming, and Arkansas and elsewhere. And this is as traditional as you can get, as large barracks in a, sometimes they're fenced in, sometimes not, but they're out in remote areas. No one's going anywhere. These are detention centers. Internment camps is the language that some like to call it today. I call them concentration camps. And we know that there was some propaganda going on regarding this as well. Staff members were required to refer to inmates as evacuees and to the facilities they plan to create as relocation centers, like a re-education center, I guess, or relocation projects rather than internment centers or concentration camps or even camps of any kind. So there was certainly a specific messaging that they wanted to push. And I will link to this in the show notes, but here's the full text of FDR's Executive Order 9102. The man was an absolute criminal for so many reasons. This, to me, was one of the worst. I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces. Here, Section 2, the Director of the War Relocation Authority is authorized and directed to formulate and effectuate a program for the removal from the areas designated from time to time by the Secretary of War or appropriate military commander under the authority of EO 9066. He doesn't want to sound like the racist pig that he was, and he didn't use any of that language, or he didn't name anybody by race in the EO, but it certainly was pretty clear what was going to happen. And when they implemented 9066 and the War Relocation Authority, we'll hear from some of their own words what they meant by this. The persons or classes of persons designated under such executive order and for their relocation, maintenance, and supervision. That was from Section 2. And here specifically, well, who would qualify for that? That's a really good question, because once they say, well, we're going to have certain people go to it, in California, it was specifically anyone who was 1/16th Japanese. I mean, think about what we were supposedly fighting against at that time. And then to say, well, if you were 1/16th of a particular race, you had to be taken away from your home. Maybe you'll get your property back. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be there forever. Maybe you won't. And you're sent to a camp. And then, of course, there was some forced labor as well. And then on top of it, you have people like General John DeWitt, who started implementing the first part of this process right after 9066. And he says, a Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether the Jap is a citizen or not. Doesn't matter. You can be born here. You could have generations of it or not, of life here. You are considered an enemy. Or here, for example, I am determined, this is from the Wartime Civil Control Administration, which was the precursor to what 9102 created. I am determined that if they have one drop of Japanese blood in them, they must go to camp. That was Carl Bendiston, who was the administrator of that program. And then in Section 7 of EO 9102, there's a forced labor program, really. I mean, that's how I read it. Maybe that's hyperbole, but there is established within the War Relocation Authority, the War Relocation Work Corps. The director shall provide by general regulations for the enlistment in such corps for the duration of the present war of persons removed under this order or under Executive Order 9066. So if people are removed from their home, their business, their work, their family, their life, and they're sent to Wyoming or wherever else to be in a camp, then they can't just sit there and read. They don't have a library. They have to work on top of it. The director shall prescribe the terms and conditions of the work to be performed by such corps and the compensation to be paid. They actually included, I missed it from my notes here, they actually included in that 1/16th or one drop of Japanese blood, they actually included 17,000 children under the age of 10 years old. Now, the first director of the WRA is this guy up on the screen, the younger brother of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man named Milton S. Eisenhower. He was actually opposed to mass internment. I'm not sure how he ended up with the job. He actually tried to reduce it once he got in there to being just adult men, leaving women and children to just remain free. And later on, he said that the purpose of the WRA was, quote, to take all people of Japanese descent into custody, surround them with troops, prevent them from buying land, and return them to their former homes at the close of the war. That's what the director of this program had to say. That was the purpose of the whole thing. Anyways, a couple of weeks after the executive order was signed, then on March 31st, 1942, and this is from Encyclopedia Britannica, Japanese Americans along the West Coast were ordered to report to control stations and register the names of all family members. They were then told when and where they should report for removal to an internment camp. And then they weren't given much time. I mean, this thing is signed, and with a matter of weeks, people are being kicked out of their homes. Japanese Americans, they write, were given from 4 days to about 2 weeks to settle their affairs and gather as many belongings as they could carry. In many cases, individuals and families were forced to sell some or all of their property, including businesses, within that period of time. And thinking about it, like, are you really getting a fair market value if you have to just rush out and sell stuff? No, it's almost as bad as putting people on boxcars, really. and they're forced, oh, take as much as you can. It'll be fine. Do they ever get it back? Who knows? Interestingly enough, as a quick aside here, and I think this ties in pretty closely, I live in a neighborhood called Little Tokyo here in downtown Los Angeles. This is the largest Japanese American population in any location in the United States. And there are remnants of this whole program all around my neighborhood. When I walk across the street, walk around, you see signs, there's museums, and there's plaques, all kinds of stuff all over the place. Like, for example, my favorite sweet shop is about a block and a half from my apartment. It's called Fugetsu Do. I've got a picture of some of the awesome, delicious stuff that they make, but they have an interesting history. They opened up in 1903, and their family was forcibly removed, so they had to leave. And now a lot of people went along voluntarily, I guess, because they didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. And one guy who actually resisted was seen as a problem. They didn't want to make it worse for the community. So let's just go along with what they say. But that doesn't mean it's still okay. And here from the history over at Fugetsu Do, Roy and Kazuko, after they returned, this is part of the family, once they returned from the camp, they struggled to reestablish the family business. First, they had to retrieve their equipment, but the property owner demanded 4 years of back rent for storing it. But when the Kitos, that's Roy and Kazuko, couldn't pay, the guy kept their machinery. So on top of it, they lose their equipment to run the business. So then they slept at the local temple down the block, while Roy worked as a waiter making 20 cents an hour. Luckily, somebody in the neighborhood helped them out and got them back on their feet. But this is a very common story. Even when the people got back, they weren't able to get back on their feet. It's really amazing stuff. I will link to that in the show notes. Now, Mr. Eisenhower couldn't last very long. He couldn't take it. He resigned after about 90 days on the job. He was just over it. Dylan S. Meyer here from Wikipedia was appointed in his place. Now, Meyer's got an interesting history too. But first of all, he asked Eisenhower if he should accept. And according to Meyer, Eisenhower advised him like this, quote, "Dylan, if you can sleep and still carry on the job, my answer would be yes. I can't sleep and do this job. I had to get out of it." So the man, whether or not we can understand why he took the job in the first place, or maybe he was on board with it at first, and once he got in, he's like, let's try to change this and make it less bad. But after 90 days, his conscience wouldn't allow him to continue, so he stepped down. And then this guy, Dylan Meyer, ended up taking the job. And interestingly enough, he ended up in the 1950s. He ended up serving as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where he was like the lead guy. He was called a terminationist. He was a lead guy pushing to relocate Native Americans off reservations and into cities. So he was all on board with relocating people based on their race. And one other interesting thing before we head out today, here also from Wikipedia, meanwhile, Fred Korematsu was a 23-year-old Japanese American man who decided to stay at his residence in San Leandro, California. This is up in the Bay Area, instead of obeying the order to relocate. So he's like, nah, I'm not going to do this. And he went so far as to actually get plastic surgery on his eyelids so he could pass as Caucasian. He changed his name to Clyde Sarah, but he still got caught. They arrested him. He ended up getting sent to one of the camps. He was kind of an outcast because many people in the community thought that he was making Japanese Americans look like people who wouldn't cooperate, and they were scared. And man, I can't imagine being alive in that scenario. But anyways, he sued. He argued that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional and that it violated the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is completely obvious. It totally did. There was no due process of law. This was an executive order. This is like a king just determined. It's exactly like that. But he lost. The Supreme Court was once again terrible and sided with the government. Closing it out here, this is how Milton Eisenhower put it. When the war is over and we consider calmly this unprecedented migration of 120,000 people, we as Americans are going to regret the unavoidable injustices that we may have done. And this article over at Politico points out that the federal government closed the last internment camp in March of 1946. in 1990. Now, it wasn't actually officially repealed until the 70s, so that was still active some decades later. And in 1990, Congress approved reparations for the surviving internees and heirs. Each received a formal apology and a check for $20,000. It's a very, very sad piece of history, but it's important for us to understand this. And when people say it can't happen here, we have to know things like this already have happened here. And we shouldn't be surprised if some monster like FDR tries to do this again in the future. Well, I hope you found this an interesting episode. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you support the work that we're doing, you want to put your financial faith behind it and help us reach and teach more people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend them when the government refuses to do so, which is constantly. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the path to liberty.